October 1950, Pyongyang, North Korea. Kim Il-sung stood at the window of his office in the government building, watching the chaos unfold in the streets below. Trucks loaded with documents and equipment rumbled past. Soldiers hurried in seemingly random directions. Civilians with belongings piled on carts and backs moved north, fleeing the capital before the Americans arrived. The city that had celebrated victory just 3 months ago was now gripped by panic. It had all gone so wrong so quickly. In June, when the Korean People's Army had crossed the 38th parallel and driven south, Kim had been certain of victory. The South Korean forces had collapsed almost immediately. Seoul had fallen in 3 days. Syngman Rhee's government had fled. Within weeks, the KPA had controlled nearly all of the Korean peninsula, pushing the remnants of South Korean and newly arrived American forces into a small perimeter around Busan. Kim had believed the war was essentially over, that Korea would be reunified under his leadership, that the revolution would triumph. Stalin had been cautious but supportive. Mao had been focused on Taiwan. And Kim had been confident that the Americans, still war-weary from World War II, would not commit the resources necessary to reverse the North Korean advance. But then came Incheon. On September 15th, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had conducted an amphibious landing at Incheon, the port city near Seoul. It was a brilliant, audacious operation that caught the North Korean forces completely by surprise. Within days, Seoul was recaptured. The supply lines to the KPA forces in the south were cut, and suddenly the North Korean army that had seemed invincible was trapped, isolated, collapsing. Kim had ordered a fighting withdrawal, had tried to maintain discipline, had hoped to establish a defensive line. But the collapse was too complete, too rapid. American and South Korean forces pushed north with unexpected speed. The 38th parallel, which Kim's forces had crossed with such confidence in June, was breached again in October, but this time it was UN forces heading north. And now they were approaching Pyongyang itself. Park Hon-young entered the room, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. Park was the leader of the South Korean communists who had fled north, a rival to Kim in some ways, but also an essential ally. He had supported the invasion, had promised that the South Korean people would rise up against Syngman Rhee's puppet regime. That uprising had never materialized. "Comrade Premier," Park said, using Kim's official title, "the latest reports are not good. American forces have crossed the Taedong River. They're less than 30 kilometers from the city. Our defenses are inadequate. Most of our best troops are still trapped in the south or have been destroyed. What we have here are garrison units, recent conscripts, men without proper equipment or training." Kim turned from the window, his face showing none of the anxiety he felt. At 38 years old, he had cultivated an image of absolute confidence, of revolutionary determination. He had fought the Japanese as a guerrilla commander in Manchuria, had been selected by the Soviets to lead North Korea after liberation, had built a personality cult that portrayed him as the great leader, the father of the nation, the embodiment of Korean independence and socialist revolution. But now, facing military catastrophe, he had to make decisions that would determine not just the outcome of the war, but his own survival. "How much time do we have?" Kim asked. "Hours, perhaps a day," Park replied. "The Americans are moving quickly. They have air superiority, armor, artillery. Our forces cannot stop them. Comrade Premier, we must evacuate. If we're captured—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both men knew what would happen if they fell into American hands. At best, a trial and imprisonment. At worst, immediate execution as war criminals. Kim walked to his desk and sat down, lighting a cigarette. "I will not flee like a coward. I will not abandon the revolution. The people need to see that their leader remains defiant, remains committed to the struggle. The people Park said carefully, would prefer that their leader remain alive to continue the struggle. A captured or dead leader cannot lead. We must withdraw to the north, regroup, and continue the resistance from there. Kim knew Park was right, but accepting it meant acknowledging defeat, meant admitting that the gamble of invading the south had failed catastrophically. He had been so certain. Stalin had advised caution, had warned that the Americans might intervene, but Kim had argued that the moment was right, that the South Korean regime was weak, that the Americans were distracted by other concerns. "I need to speak to the people," Kim said suddenly. "I need to make a radio address. They need to hear from me, need to understand that this is not the end but a temporary setback." Park looked doubtful but nodded. "I'll arrange it, but Comrade Premier, after the broadcast, we must leave. The Americans could be here by tomorrow." An hour later, Kim stood before a microphone in the radio station, preparing to address what remained of North Korea. His aides had assembled in the studio, their faces tense. Everyone knew this might be the last broadcast from Pyongyang, that the capital was about to fall to the enemy. Kim cleared his throat and began speaking in Korean, his voice steady and strong despite the chaos outside. "Dear brothers and sisters, citizens of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, soldiers of our glorious People's Army, great danger threatens our motherland and its people. The American imperialists and their puppet allies have invaded our sacred territory. They have brought war to our land, destruction to our cities, suffering to our people." He paused, letting his words sink in. In homes and military units across North Korea, people listened with growing fear and desperation. "But we will not surrender. We will not submit to imperialist aggression. This is a sacred war of liberation, a struggle for the freedom and independence of our nation. The American invaders think they can crush the Korean Revolution, can destroy everything we have built, can turn back the tide of history. They are wrong." Even as he spoke the defiant words, Kim wondered if they were true. Could North Korea survive this onslaught? Could the revolution continue if Pyongyang fell, if the North Korean state collapsed entirely? We must ask ourselves, what is needed to liquidate this menace? What must we do to defend our homeland? The answer is simple. We must fight. Every man, every woman, every citizen must contribute to the defense of our nation. We must resist the invaders with every means at our disposal. We must show them that the Korean people cannot be defeated, cannot be enslaved, cannot be conquered. He could hear his own voice rising, taking on the revolutionary fervor that had characterized his speeches since the beginning of the war. But he also knew that words alone would not stop American tanks and aircraft. The imperialists have superior weapons, yes. They have more planes, more tanks, more guns. But we have something they can never possess. We have the revolutionary spirit of the Korean people. We have the determination to defend our freedom and independence at any cost. We have justice on our side, history on our side, the future on our side. After the broadcast ended, Kim sat in silence for a moment. His aides waited nervously, knowing that the next decision would be the most important of Kim's life. "We leave tonight," Kim said finally. "Prepare vehicles for the government. We'll go to Kangye, near the Chinese border. From there, we can continue to direct the resistance." Park Hon-yong looked relieved. "A wise decision, Comrade Premier. And what about our allies? Have we heard from Moscow or Beijing?" Kim's expression darkened. "Stalin says he cannot intervene directly. He fears it will provoke a wider war with the Americans, perhaps even nuclear war. But he's promised to provide equipment and support. As for Mao," he paused. "Mao is considering sending volunteers to help us. Chinese troops, officially not part of the Chinese army, to maintain the fiction that China is not directly involved in the war." "Will he actually send them?" Park asked. "He must," Kim said firmly. "If he doesn't, North Korea will cease to exist. The Americans will conquer the entire peninsula, will establish a hostile capitalist state on China's border. Mao understands this. He will send troops. He must send troops. But even as he said it, Kim felt a gnawing uncertainty. The Chinese were still consolidating their own revolution, were planning to invade Taiwan, had their own priorities. Would they really commit hundreds of thousands of troops to save North Korea? Or would they let Kim's regime collapse and establish a new, more compliant leadership? That night, as darkness fell over Pyongyang, a convoy of vehicles assembled in front of the government buildings. Kim Il-sung, his family, key government officials, and essential personnel climbed into trucks and cars. Documents were loaded, equipment packed, the remnants of the North Korean state prepared to flee before the American advance. Kim took one last look at the city he was abandoning. Pyongyang, the capital of his revolution, the symbol of North Korean independence, was about to fall to the enemy. Street lights were already being extinguished to avoid providing targets for American bombers. The city was emptying, its population fleeing north ahead of the approaching UN forces. "Comrade Premier, we must go," one of his aides urged. Kim nodded and climbed into the back seat of a Soviet-made sedan. As the convoy pulled away from the government building and headed north through the darkened streets, Kim stared out the window, thinking about how it had all gone wrong. He had been so certain the invasion would succeed. The South Korean army had been weak, poorly trained, badly equipped. Syngman Rhee's government had been unpopular, corrupt, oppressive. Kim had been told by his intelligence services, that the South Korean people would welcome liberation, would join the revolution, would help overthrow the puppet regime. But that hadn't happened. The South Korean people had not risen up. American forces had intervened quickly and decisively, and now Kim's entire project of Korean reunification lay in ruins. The convoy drove north through the night, passing columns of refugees and scattered military units trying to establish defensive positions. The roads were clogged, chaotic, a visible manifestation of the North Korean state's collapse. Kim closed his eyes, exhausted but unable to sleep. He thought about the messages he had sent to Stalin and Mao, pleading for help, admitting privately in coded diplomatic language that North Korea could not survive without foreign intervention. To Stalin, he had written, "The situation is critical. Without Soviet air support and equipment, we cannot stop the American advance. We need immediate assistance to preserve the socialist state in Korea." To Mao, he had been even more desperate. "If the war continues without Chinese support, the revolution will be destroyed. We still need your help and would want your direct military intervention. Without it, Korea will fall to the imperialists." It was humiliating to beg for help, to admit weakness, to acknowledge that his own forces were insufficient, but Kim had no choice. Pride meant nothing if it resulted in the destruction of everything he had built. The convoy reached Kangye, a small city in the mountainous north near the Chinese border 3 days later. It was a bleak, cold place, barely more than a town, with none of Pyongyang's grandeur or administrative infrastructure. But it was far from the American advance, protected by mountains, close enough to China that evacuation would be possible if necessary. Kim established his temporary headquarters in a modest building that had once served as a local government office. Maps were hung on the walls. Radio equipment was installed. What remained of the North Korean government tried to function in drastically reduced circumstances. "What is our current military situation?" Kim asked his generals at the first meeting in Kangye. The answers were devastating. The North Korean People's Army had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Of the nearly 200,000 troops that had invaded South Korea in June, less than a quarter remained combat effective. The rest had been killed, captured, or had deserted. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Most of the tanks, artillery, and vehicles provided by the Soviets were gone. "We have perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers who can still fight," one general reported. "But they're scattered, disorganized, poorly equipped. We can conduct guerrilla operations, can harass the American advance, but we cannot stop it. Within weeks, unless something changes, the Americans will control the entire peninsula. Kim absorbed this information in silence. Then he asked the question everyone was thinking. Have the Chinese responded? Will they send troops? We have received word, Park Hon-yong said carefully, that Chinese forces are massing near the Yalu River. Estimates suggest several 100,000 troops, possibly more. They are described as volunteers, but they are regular Chinese army units. If they cross the border. When they cross the border, Kim corrected. When, not if. Mao will not abandon us. He cannot afford to let the Americans reach the Chinese border. He will intervene. Over the following weeks, as American and UN forces pushed north, as Pyongyang fell and foreign troops occupied the North Korean capital for the first time since liberation, Kim Il-sung waited in Gangneung for the Chinese intervention that would save his regime. He spent his days issuing orders to scattered North Korean units, coordinating with Soviet advisors, maintaining radio contact with whatever parts of his government were still functioning. And he spent his nights smoking cigarettes, staring at maps, and contemplating what would happen if the Chinese didn't come, if he had gambled everything on a rescue that never materialized. During one of these long nights, Kim reflected on how he had gotten here. He thought about his youth in Manchuria, fighting the Japanese as part of a guerrilla unit. He thought about his selection by the Soviets to lead North Korea, chosen because he was Korean but loyal to Moscow, capable but controllable. He thought about the years building the North Korean state, establishing the personality cult, eliminating rivals, consolidating power. And he thought about the decision to invade South Korea, the moment when he had convinced Stalin that the time was right, that victory was assured, that Korean reunification could be achieved quickly and decisively. I was too confident, he admitted to himself in the darkness, too certain that the South would collapse, that the Americans would not intervene, that military victory would be easy. I underestimated the enemy. I overestimated our own capabilities, and now we are paying the price. But even in this moment of private doubt, Kim's public persona remained defiant. When he addressed the remaining North Korean forces by radio, when he issued proclamations to the population, he maintained the revolutionary rhetoric, the certainty of ultimate victory, the conviction that the American imperialists would be defeated. "This is a temporary setback," he declared in one broadcast. "The Americans may occupy our cities, but they cannot occupy our spirit. They may control our territory, but they cannot control our determination. We will fight on, we'll resist, we'll never surrender. The revolution will triumph." And then, in late October, the Chinese came. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers crossed the Yalu River under cover of darkness, moving into position in the North Korean mountains. They moved at night to avoid American airstrikes, marched on foot to remain undetected, prepared to launch a massive surprise attack on the overextended UN forces. When Kim received confirmation that Chinese troops were in North Korea, that they were preparing to attack, he felt overwhelming relief. The revolution would survive. North Korea would continue to exist. He would remain in power. On October 25th, Chinese forces launched their first major attack, catching American and UN troops by surprise. The offensive was devastating. American units that had been advancing confidently toward the Chinese border suddenly found themselves surrounded by vast numbers of Chinese soldiers. The tide of the war reversed almost overnight. Kim issued a triumphant statement. "Our great Chinese allies have joined the sacred struggle against American imperialism. Together, we will drive the invaders from our soil. Together, we will defend the freedom and independence of Korea. The imperialists thought they had won, but they have awakened a sleeping giant. Their defeat is inevitable." Over the following months, Chinese intervention would save the North Korean state. The war would stabilize roughly along the 38th parallel, where it had begun. Eventually, in 1953, an armistice would be signed, leaving Korea divided much as it had been before Kim's invasion. But Kim Il-sung would survive. His regime would continue. And in the decades that followed, North Korean propaganda would rewrite the history of the war, portraying Kim as a brilliant strategist who had lured the Americans into a trap, who had never really been in danger, who had always been confident of victory. The reality was different. In October 1950, as American troops closed in on Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung had been desperate, frightened, uncertain whether his revolution would survive. He had fled the capital, had pleaded with China and the Soviet Union for help, had watched his army disintegrate and his state collapse. But he had also refused to surrender. He had maintained defiance even in defeat. He had preserved the core of his regime in the mountains of the north, and when Chinese intervention came, he had survived to rebuild, to consolidate power, to establish the dynasty that would rule North Korea for generations. On the night he fled Pyongyang, sitting in the back of that Soviet sedan as the convoy drove north through the darkness, Kim Il-sung had said to one of his aides, "We may lose battles, we may lose territory, we may lose the capital itself, but as long as we survive, as long as the revolution continues, we have not truly lost. The Americans think they have won, but they will learn you cannot defeat an idea with guns and bombs. Korean independence, socialist revolution, the dream of reunification, these cannot be destroyed by military force, and I will live to see that dream realized, no matter how long it takes." It would take more than 70 years, and the dream of reunification under North Korean leadership would remain unfulfilled. But Kim Il-sung's regime would survive, would endure, would pass to his son and grandson. The state he founded in those desperate days of October 1950, fleeing before American troops, would become one of the most isolated and militarized nations on earth. And it all began with those words spoken in a radio broadcast as Pyongyang was about to fall. "Great danger threatens our motherland and its people, but we will not surrender. This is a sacred war of liberation." Defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Revolutionary rhetoric masking desperate fear. The survival instinct of a leader who refused to accept defeat even as his state collapsed around him. That was what Kim Il-sung said when American troops were closing in, and somehow, against all odds, he survived to fight another day.